Welcome. I'm Jim Golden, and this is a program about replacing the lies that cripple us, a life story. When I was 51 years old, I had a seizure in the middle of the night. If my wife hadn't found me, I might have died. A seizure, a grand mal seizure in my case, is destructive electrical activity in your brain. I lost the ability to think clearly or much at all. I lost the ability to work. I lost motor skills. I couldn't drive. My nervous system was wrecked. I immediately went into sort of hyperactivity. I couldn't stay still for a second. When I woke up in the hospital, I was immediately moving, and it's hard for them to get me to stay still even for a moment. And I went into a deep anxiety and depression, confusion. I had to move in. I needed constant care. My wife had a job, so I had to move across town and move in with my mother at the age of 51. I couldn't stand any noise, and or even to go to her bedroom in our old house to sleep. I was in constant fear and confusion. I slept on the couch for months in her living room. I lost 30, 40 pounds, and some people think I looked about 15 years older. I shuffled when I walked. I had no appetite. I really would rather not have been alive, not lived. I was living in torture. I wasn't going to take my life. I knew that was not right, and I wouldn't do that to my family. But when I woke up each morning, regained consciousness, I dreaded that and wished I could go back to sleep. I had come to a place where I was living with the greatest fear I had ever had, and that is that I would be like my father. My father, who hadn't been able to provide for the family, hadn't been able to produce, be creative. My father, who had abandoned us, my mother and my two sisters and myself. I'm speaking to you today because God used that experience in others to replace a lie that crippled me for years. And that lie was, you're only valuable to the extent that you can perform. You're only as good as your last evaluation, basically. And he replaced that lie with the truth that it's in our sonship, in our daughtership, in our relationship with God, and then ultimately through him with others that we have our true value. I now use that experience to connect with students and leaders from all over the world at Harvard and elsewhere to explore how that truth about who we really are, why we have value, and how God is relevant, not just to personal piety or what happens in a church, though that's extremely important, but what happens in the rest of life and all of society, how his goodness and practical truth transforms law, how we do business, how we do government, as well as our personal lives, our families, and our relationships with them. I teach practical ways, including the most practical of all in many ways, the most comprehensive of all, and that is how to treat others as you would wish to be treated. I'm telling you this story today because I believe that that lie and some others that we'll talk about today is not unique to me, but that even among believers, to greater or lesser extents, we sometimes believe that lie. And as change agents, as leaders, as followers of Christ, it's particularly important for us to know not just the truth about this, but how to practically take steps that apply that truth. In that regard, I've just gotten two questions that came in, and I don't know who asked these, but whoever you are, these are fabulous questions. How to really believe in truth rather than the lies in our life. And lies are so attractive. That's the first one. And that's a incredibly probative question. How to really believe truth. We'll talk about that. That's really what this is about. And, you know, if you really believe it, you're inclined to act in conformity to it. So we can give, I think you're maybe working at, we can give mental assent to something, but not truly believe it because we're not prepared to act in accordance with it as we go through life in practical situations. Second question. It's one thing to recognize a lie, but another to turn the corner and start living the truth. Can you share from your own experience in this regard? Yeah, that's a big part of this presentation today. It's how to apply the truth that we already know, that we've already given mental assent to, and to provide very practical means of doing that. In some more secular environments, much of my discussion is about what is truth? Does objective truth exist? Is there a God? Is the universe open or closed? If so, how does that apply to law or government or life? In this context, I'll be speaking more about how to practically apply the truths that we already sign off on intellectually. And of course, how you do that is the gospel and goes far, far beyond this or any other presentation. But hopefully this presentation will give you some practical means, some handles, some steps, not a formula, but some approaches, some of which will be applicable perhaps in your life and others of which have absolutely no application, but items for you to consider in a prayerful way and see if God has something for you there. So the story, when I was 8 years old, I found myself in the front seat of the family car. My mother was to my left, and my two sisters, younger, were in the back seat. We were leaving Cleveland, Tennessee to travel to Knoxville, Tennessee, where my aunt and uncle lived. We were going to move in with them. We were leaving my father in Chattanooga. In Cleveland. He had lost control of his emotions and was very sad and very angry. He and my mother fought a lot. And I only saw my father one time after that. He later died when I was in high school many years later. The other thing that was important was that my father's name, James, the same as mine, though I was then known as Jimmy, was never mentioned. No one ever told us. I was 8, my sister's younger, you know, kids don't ever mention James. We just somehow knew that if we mentioned him, it would be terribly embarrassing to everyone. So we concluded that he was very shameful, that something about him was fatally flawed. We wouldn't have left otherwise, and he would have been mentioned otherwise. It was as though he had never existed. We reasoned in our little children's minds that if he was shameful and if he was our father, we must be shameful too. We didn't make some kind of conclusion that was conscious. We just believed we were shameful as well because he was. So that experience taught me a lie. And the lie was, my value is dependent on my performance. I will not be like my father. He didn't try hard enough. If he had tried hard enough, things would have been different in our family. The will is sufficient for us to do well, live well. And second, I will never abandon my family simply as a function of will. That will never happen to me. That will never occur in my family. And I won't be shameful because I will be productive. And so when Christmas would roll around, my mom would ask all of us what we wanted for Christmas, and I would think, what I really would love is to see my dad. But of course, I never said that because we couldn't mention him. So I said a bike or ping pong table or whatever. By the way, my mother and my aunt and uncle, other members of the family, were extremely good people, followers of Christ, loved God, loved us well. They thought they were protecting us by not mentioning him. So their intentions were the very best. As time passed, I realized that his not coming or calling or writing was really, really hurting a lot. And I decided that I would stop that hurt. If he didn't love me, didn't love us, I wouldn't love him. So I shut down that love and I shut down the pain. I just pushed it right down and sort of sealed it up. And I decided I wouldn't do the feeling thing. It just didn't pay. My dad felt, my dad let his emotions control him, I felt. And so I wasn't going to make that same mistake. So that led me to adopt the second line, that is, emotions are dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. I went to the Army, to Fort Ord in California, and during basic training and advanced infantry training, I determined that I would not feel fear, that I would not be intimidated no matter what they did to me, that I would do my duty, but that I would not be intimidated. That's how I would win that battle. In fact, they were smarter than I was, not a big surprise. They did this for a living. And what they did is they made me feel an emotion, not fear, but anger. Anger at them, at a drill sergeant that was, really demeaning and just things that they do just to make you angry. They're very good at it. And so what that did is it took the lid off of what the feelings that I had been sort of covering up, not recognizing, not giving any legitimacy to for many years. And that came boiling out, and it was very powerful. So they accomplished their purpose, because you could have pointed me at something, an enemy, and I would have destroyed something or done my best to do so. I also found that in law school, anger was rewarded. We had a moot court competition mock trial where the students competed in a trial that wasn't real, but we had a real judge, and we were in a make-believe courtroom in the law school. And I used that anger and trying harder to think well, to speak precisely, to intimidate a witness. I asked for the judge to allow me to approach the witness. And as I walked toward him, I began to put the pieces in place to box him in. And as I got very close to him, I unleashed anger and intimidation, and the witness broke. I won that competition for my law school, and later learned that that actually was something which was useful in a litigation setting in real life. I was also taught by, in some ways unspoken, in some ways subtle, but nevertheless taught that God was irrelevant to law, that in many, many cases, justice was really a joke, just a social construct, just the use of power by those elites which had it, and that in many ways there was no difference between right and wrong, good and evil. Everything was relative. And so that, plus the fact that the particular church that I was a part of didn't really address the issues of how to apply biblical principles in law or business or government, except as to a few of the most obvious things: don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, those kinds of things. But how do you actually apply that in a circumstance where there's going to be one winner and one loser in a trial, and that person who is most articulate, strikes hard and fast, most strategic, channels others' emotions, intimidates, is likely to win. So though I rejected the idea that there was no truth, that everything was relative, that God had no application to law, I really struggled with how to apply it beyond those basic moral rules. So I continued to strike fast and hard because it was necessary to win, used anger and aggression to get my way. One of the byproducts of that was that it spilled over into the rest of my life. It's very hard to contain that once it comes out. If it's what's in you, it'll find expression then in your family, and even hurt those that you would give your life for because you love them so much. God graciously, mercifully used people, events, Holy Spirit, principles, specific methodologies or spiritual disciplines to help me overcome these lies, to show that they were not true with His truth and His love. One big event which contributed to that process was I was sitting in church in Nashville, Tennessee. We had sent a group of our church members to Kyiv, Ukraine. It was after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and they had delivered wheelchairs, and they came back and just talked about rolling people out into the sunlight who had been confined to these flats for years, and what they experienced, how the people reacted when they were just giving them a practical manifestation of God's love for them and not asking for anything in return. And during that service, I began to feel a pure love for people that I didn't know in Kyiv, Ukraine, that was so good and so pure that I knew I could not have been the source for that love. It must be from above. And so I concluded that God must be calling us to travel there and minister to those people, to be somehow a part of giving them love and restoration in ways that He would enable. So after service, I told my wife that and said, I think we should I should stop practicing law and we should move to Kyiv and you'll show us what to do. And she looked at me and said, I thought the same thing during that service. I'd reached the same conclusion. Over lunch that Sunday, we told our children about calling, a specific call to go to Ukraine. And no, Ukraine, Kyiv was not another subdivision in Nashville, and no, it didn't have a pool. It was another city in a very different country, and that God had called us. And then we talked also about His general call to all of us to become His children. And Laura, my second youngest, at that time, maybe 7 or so, accepted Christ that day. So that was a huge milestone for us and a blessing that God gave us from that discussion of calling. When we arrived, we encountered a society that was devastated in so many different ways. The hryvnia, you needed millions of them to buy most of anything. It had been debased through hyperinflation. Institutions had been destroyed, families fragmented. Of course, those things are true to a greater or lesser extent in any society, but those things were particularly significant at that particular time. There was great confusion. The people there had suffered under the czars and then the commissars for generations. And I was confronted with a challenge. We founded a Center for Leadership Development to teach servant leadership to the future leaders of the country. And we encountered the suffering, the questions, And I could either try to hold people at arm's length and not be vulnerable, not enter into their emotions, or as I realized, I could share their sorrows and their joys. But that meant I had to feel their emotions, which opened me to feeling my own. So the second lie fell. This lie that emotions are dangerous and should be avoided at all cost. And I embraced the truth that God gives us the ability to have great emotional and relational intelligence, and that in fact, they're indispensable in forming real relationships. Why does this truth matter to transformative change agents who are following Christ? Because emotions connect us with others. It's certainly not the only thing, but they're indispensable. And it's impossible to bring about transformation in individuals, in society, and institutions without deep relationships. Another event occurred years later after we returned to the United States. That was the seizure that I've talked about. That ended as follows. I was there in my mom's room, and my wife came over on Christmas Eve, and she said, "Jim, you really need to come home. The girls need to have you there on Christmas." And I told you about the state I was in, and I said, "I can't, and I don't want the girls to see me like this." And she said, "You must. They need you, and I need you. And what you need to understand is, even though you're not producing for us, we still love you. And God still loves you. He hasn't given up on you, and he never will." That was transformative. That addresses this question of how do we really believe truth. I had signed off on unconditional love from God at a young age when I came to him, but that drove a spike in the ground that I can always look at and know that he loves me in particular. I did go home. We did have Christmas. They did love me despite all of my failures and my weaknesses. And God strengthened me to the point that I applied for a job, called a man who had built a $800 million company. It was a trucking company. It had gone public, and he, I thought, needed a chief legal officer. So I called and pitched having a job for him, even though I was still very weak. And he invited me to come down to Chattanooga, a couple of hours away, and interview. I got off the phone and realized that if I drove for 2 hours, even an hour, I would be totally exhausted. I was still very weak physically. And I also needed a great deal of clarity to be able to communicate with this man. And I really had applied for a job that I didn't even know exactly what you did. So I went to the UT Law Library and looked up general counsel and saw what they did. And I got my mother to drive me to my interview to be the chief legal officer of a public company. I laid in the back seat while she drove that 2 hours. She prayed for me before I went in and while I was in the interview. And when I walked through the door, God gave me clarity and strength. And I was able to have a wonderful communication with that CEO, a man who loves God and follows him and has been a witness to me. And so I had a second interview and was hired. And he gave me then the opportunity to learn specific ways of applying his truth, his love, to all kinds of tough circumstances that we faced in business and in law. The reason that we faced that is because the trucks drove 1 million miles a day, weighing as much as 80,000 pounds. and at interstate speeds many times. And many accidents inevitably occurred. And therefore, people were killed. When a truck that big hits a car, it's often worse on the occupants of the car. And others were terribly, terribly injured for life. I went to the CEO after I saw sort of how our panel counsel around the United States were handling those cases. And I said, I thought we could do better, improve the way we were doing. We were doing some things right, but I would like to do something more revolutionary in how we dealt with those families and their attorneys. And of course, it was based on Matthew 7, and everything do unto others what you would have them do unto you, for this sums up the law and the prophets, Jesus Christ. I told you that he was a man of God. He gave me the permission, empowered me to go out and try that. And I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it at all, but to investigate it and go out and be proactive and determine how we could do that in this context. So how did I do that? What did I learn in that process? The first was to be authentic, to align identity, who I am in Christ, with purpose, principles, words, and actions. It's another word for authenticity or integrity. We don't have time to go into this really important topic of identity in great detail today, but sufficient to say that one of the young ladies at Harvard Business School once remarked after she had left a class where I'd spoken, I now know I'll never know what to do until I know who I am. Very, very important insight. Until we know our ultimate purpose, until we know what we value most, until we know the answers to the most important questions in life, it's very hard to know how to go forward in a meaningful way. One way to do that I found in this practice, I call it negotiation counsel, is to be candid about weaknesses as well as strengths. And of course, to say only what you really mean. And I think this applies in any context. The other thing is to build strong relationships. That's a big one. Obviously, that has a lot to do with all of the law and the prophets and Jesus' message to us, the essence of the gospel. And I would say what I learned was that it's important to take the initiative to love your neighbor, including your enemies. Be proactive, take initiative and responsibility. So I just called the defense counsel in some of the states and said, I'm going to come out and meet with the family if their attorney will allow me, and the attorney, and give them genuine condolences from us. I don't want to simply ignore them for 2 years until we get to trial. I think someone should stand face to face and tell the family, tell the attorney that we're terribly sorry for their loss. And that means exposing yourself to the cynicism of the attorney. It means exposing yourself in some situations to a mother who's lost her only daughter and who screams at you as she slides 8x10 photos of the daughter at her graduation and her casket at her funeral across the desk to you. It means praying as that's happening and praying for God's guidance on how to not give a defensive reaction, but to treat her as you would want your mother to be treated if you had been killed. It means asking lawyers to share a meal with you and getting to know them personally, even though they're your avowed enemy and there's a huge animosity typically between the company lawyer or the defense lawyer and the plaintiff's lawyer on the other side. It means being the first giver, writing a check to the family, sometimes a very large check, because otherwise they would lose their house. The breadwinner has been killed. They would lose their health insurance. They wouldn't have the money to even treat their health conditions which have arisen as a result of the accident, and not asking for any kind of thing in return, no releases, nothing. If you go to trial and they get a verdict, they get that verdict in addition to what you've given them. It's a gift. It's just a means to help so that they don't have to suffer unnecessary harm after the accident that could have been avoided because someone's trying to get them to settle and using their need for immediate money in order to try to facilitate that. It means giving lots of information to their attorney very early on. I mean, 3-ring binders full of information about the equipment, the repair records on the truck, the drivers, their hours of service, whether they were on some kind of something that would have caused them to wreck, and all of which is important in an evaluation of that claim. And it means to be fair, to offer fair amounts and not try to take advantage. It means seeking the true facts in resolving disputes instead of taking whatever position favors you. So I would do things like, instead of just hiring the normal defense expert who's confronted by the normal plaintiff's expert, get the 2 normal experts used by the defense and the plaintiff, whether it's a medical expert to determine how badly they are harmed, or some kind of accident reconstructionist or engineer to determine what caused the accident. Get these 2 experts that routinely are hired by the defense or the plaintiff to choose a 3rd expert, not normally hired by either side, but very well recognized and knowledgeable in that field, to issue the report, to tell us what really happened and why and how great the harm was. It means sometimes real practical ways of turning the other cheek. Sometimes I have confronted plaintiffs' attorneys represent the families who are very cynical of what I'm trying to do, and I'm sometimes attacked or demeaned. Certainly that's not always the case. Sometimes they're gracious and they sign off on this early, but to respond with quiet compassion and practical ways to help the grieving family not suffer additional harm while we're working out the details of the legal settlement. And it means listening with your heart as well as your head. Very important to forming relationships. Can't be overstated. And I've been terrible at this in the past. I had a time in my life when I was extraordinarily busy, and my wife and own family had little access to me. I was involved in some political work. And when you're in the public eye, it puts a lot of extra heat on your family, your wife, your children. I came home and found my wife reading the editorial page of one of the local papers, crying. My children were afraid, sometimes just embarrassed or afraid at school, afraid of the implications of moving to Washington, having press around us a great deal, so we're always in a fishbowl. And my wife called and said, "I really need you to come home. I just need to talk with you." And I said, "I'd love to, but I can't. You don't know what I've got going here." And she said, "Come home. I need you." So I left and went home, and I sat across the kitchen table, no more than 3 or 4 feet away from her, and listened for 15, 20 minutes, and kept good eye contact, never looked at anything else. But I was thinking about a lot of things that I had to do. And she stopped and said, "Tell me one thing." I said, I realized I couldn't. And that was devastating to her. Great failure on my part that I still regret. I thought I could fix it with a cognitive memory exercise. So after that, when she spoke, I would, on an ongoing basis, create a sort of a loop of memory in my head so that if she ever stopped and asked me that question again, I could repeat word for word her last sentence or two. And the funny thing about that was often she would say after I repeated word for word what she just said, "You're not listening." I couldn't understand what she meant. I just repeated word for word what she said. How could I do that if I wasn't listening? What she meant was, you haven't heard my heart. You're listening with your head, at least part of your head. Listen to what I can't even say. Listen to why I'm saying it. Listen to me asking you to be with me in this time as opposed to just give me a quick fix. Listen to my heart. Over time, God has given me an understanding of what that means, and I can't tell you how important it is in relationships, in business and law and diplomacy, and certainly in our families. Just stop and listen. And that makes you vulnerable in some ways, but it's worth it. Building trust. That's the very foundation of relationships. And some people get very academic about this and talk about skills and talk about body language and talk about micro movements and how you can build trust. I think some of those things have their legitimacy, but sometimes you can appear to be building trust or build trust based on the wrong basis, and it's actually destructive. I think we build real trust by earning it, by being trustworthy. Practice gratefulness. When things go well, thank God. Realize it was a gift from Him and not the reason for pride. I think my wife has taught me a very important lesson: to number blessings, to write down with specificity things we're grateful for, or to think about them, meditate on them, and thank God for them. But the idea here is not to have it so general. The birds, the symphony of birds that I heard this morning in the giant oaks in our front yard, very specific things. By the way, I highly recommend Ann Voskamp's book, 1,000 Gifts. She details the spiritual discipline of writing these down, and the effect in her life and the life of thousands of others who have utilized this discipline has been extreme, including my wife. And now, to some extent, a lesser extent, because I've been practicing not nearly so long in my own life. And when things go badly, look at that as an opportunity to trust God, to learn from Him. Anyway, despite that fact. And get to know mature disciples of the Lord. You can do this through reading of the greats, or sometimes God will give you an immense blessing and allow you to come to know a person who has walked closely with the Lord for a long time and who has been transformed to a huge extent by Him. The joy, the peace, the love, the truth in these people, it's really beyond description. It's palpable. I met a man named Dallas Willard, and he told me of practices and how we can go to a much different place than of transformation than we generally see, and then he embodied that. I actually attacked him in a small public forum the first time he said these things because I thought it was inconceivable. I never really encountered it to that extent in another human personally. But it turned out that it was right. And these things are not opposed to intellect. They are in addition to it. He's also one of the most knowledgeable and brightest people I've ever known. And getting to know him was hugely beneficial. And I've read so much of his work, but again, spending time with him is huge. And sometimes we can spend time with people through their books, even after they're deceased. So that taught me practical ways to confront this lie that Christian principles have limited applicability outside our private piety, and that Christian principles add value in every sphere of life, and that there are really, practical ways that we can pursue that. Why does this matter to us as Christian change agents? Well, because it transforms us. It frees us from shame, lack of purpose, the need to prove we're valuable by our performance, fear of failure, and it enables us to be a solvent for cynicism, to challenge the great lies of our age, to be a living demonstration of God's goodness and relevance in all of life, in the whole of society, to be a catalyst for replacing sorrow and hate with healing and forgiveness. It means that sometimes you'll find yourself walking into a rehabilitation facility where a woman who lost her son in an accident caused by a driver in your client, and who has her two grandchildren there with her because their mother, her son's wife, is hanging clothes on a clothesline as a means of therapy because that's her highest level of cognitive functioning due to a traumatic brain injury that she suffered in that accident. And it means caring and listening to that grandmother and to her questions and concerns about how she's going to raise those children, how she's going to deal with her grief. Her lawyer called me later and said, my client, this lady, wants to fire me and hire you. I told her she couldn't do that because you're on the other side. But I think she wanted to do that because she could tell I really cared and that I was determined, for the grace of God, to do the right thing by her and those children. When that case was settled and everything was over, in the final meeting, she came to me and said, tell the driver of the truck that I know he didn't mean to kill my son and that I forgive him. That is transformative change.